Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. For those of you that are regular watchers, sorry for the repetition of this. This is part of the Skeptic Society and Skeptic Magazine, our continued attempts to reach out on many different platforms to promote science and reason and critical thinking and skepticism, of course. To that extent, as usual, I appreciate your support of the podcast and the society in general. You can do that at skeptic.com/donate or just contact us by phone or at skeptic.com. Our address and phone numbers are all there. And again, we are a nonprofit. We absolutely depend on donations to the society to keep us going. The podcast has been growing in numbers and interest, and I just think it's a great way to communicate ideas. My guest for this episode is Ben Shapiro, the now super famous Ben Shapiro. His book is The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. Most of you will know Ben as a conservative. His main gig is doing political commentary, but he also gets into things about human nature and the history of civilization, science and reason. And that's what this book is about. His thesis is that what made the West great is, at least at its foundation, the Judeo-Christian worldview. And then from there, it builds on other things that came later. I'm just repeating his thesis here, things like democracy, market capitalism, science, technology, medicine, industry. These things are all essential. So Ben is not making the simpler argument that Dinesh D'Souza made in his book, What's So Great About Christianity, which is that it's all about Christianity. I mean, Dinesh admits you need some Athens. Jerusalem and Athens is the theme that Ben pushes, which is what Dinesh talks about as well. The problem is the counterexamples, societies that predated the Judeo-Christian worldview and flourished and had magnificent architecture and art and literature and so on, and the societies that came after that were also very Christian that did not have successful societies. And there's lots of examples of those that I give to Ben, and he responds to that by saying it's multiple factors. It's a multivariate formula, as it were, the way a social scientist would think of it. So we discussed that and the nature of human nature, reason, science, the history of science. We get into current events to that extent, to the extent that the worldview you hold as a foundation then it results in different outcomes down the road. Unfortunately, we do get sidetracked into free will and determinism. I didn't really want to go down there. I wasn't even thinking about it. But it came up, and I'm a compatibilist, like about 59% of professional philosophers. Ben feels that's something of a cop-out, that you should either be a libertarian free will position, or you should hold the strict determinist position like someone like Sam Harris holds. And I disagree. So we talk about that and then shift to the end of the book, which is all about finding purpose and meaning in life, and that the distinction between happiness and meaning is an important one to make, and I was glad to see Ben does that. He ends the book. It's a beautiful, very touching story at the end, and which I read at the end of toward the end of the podcast. And so, to that extent, I think as a fellow member of the intellectual dark web, Ben and I can have a conversation like this. Have some pretty strong disagreements about some fundamental issues like free will and the nature of human nature, where we get reason, the origins of these cognitive capacities. Of course, he's religious, so he throws that element in. I'm not. We talk about atheism and what that means, humanism, Pinker, Harris, so forth. We get into all that. So enjoy the conversation. I give you Ben Shapiro with the new book, The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. Now, so I just thought I would make a few notes of what I agree with. Yes, that things are going quite well. I am concerned that we might be blowing it, although I don't go quite as far as you do. The things we agree on to start is that things are good because of democracy in the form of a constitutional republic with checks on balances. checks on power, capitalism and free trade, science, technology, medicine, industry, and civil rights and civil liberties. We disagree on their source. So you start with the Judaism and the idea that we were all created in God's image, and from that you start to build. So give us your thesis there of how you get from there to capitalism and democracy and so forth.
Sure. So I think that whether you are an atheist or whether you are a religious believer, there are certain fundamental principles you have to accept to believe in a free market. And some of those fundamental principles include the idea that every other human being is of innate value. So in the religious view, this begins with the idea that every human being is made in the image of God. So historically, I trace that to the biblical change from sort of the Hammurabi Code vision, which is that only prominent people were created in the image of the gods. Those were the important people. The idea that every human being has innate value has to be a fundamental assumption. And one of the quibbles that I have, and I think it may be more than a quibble, with secular humanists is the idea that this is just discoverable by human reason and innately self-evident. I don't think that's self-evident. I think that's it seems self-evident because we've grown through a millennia-long tradition that basically says this. So every human being has innate value. Every human being is endowed with basic capacity for reason, and that we ought to use reason to move through the issues as opposed to tribal or identity or just simple power relations. That I trace to sort of Greek principles. So the book's fundamental premise is that the West is built on Jerusalem and Athens and the interplay between the two, between Greek logic and Greek reason, the value of human reason, and the fundamental Judeo-Christian principles of innate value, that human beings have the capacity and the obligation to understand the universe, that human beings are reflective to a certain extent of the mind of God, that we can actually sense objective truth. Like the very notion of objective truth relies on the idea that there is something discoverable out there that we, not for evolutionary reasons, but for truth reasons, can see that there are objectively true things. These are fundamental assumptions that have to be made by secular humanists. They're fundamental principles to Judeo-Christian belief. And so the essential thesis that I hold when it comes to, and I mention you in the book several times in this context, and Sam Harris and folks in the IDW, with whom I agree on a broad majority of basic political principles. The point that I'm making is that I'm not sure that all of these are discoverable simply through the use of unbridled human reason, or at least they're not self-evident, that these are tradition-based principles, and then we reason our way back to those principles in sort of post hoc fashion, which is fine and good. But if you undermine the religious principles themselves, then it's very difficult to allow the edifice to stand. So that's why, I know I'm jumping forward a little bit here, but that's
okay.
That's I think the fundamental contention that I make with regard to Judeo-Christian religion. Again, not saying that everybody has to be a Jew or everybody has to be a Christian, or that you have to believe that Judaism and Christianity are wonderful for the world as a general rule. But the fundamental assumptions of Western civilization are not empirical or reason-based. They are assumptions that are made originally for religious reasons and then reasoned through and supported by reason. I don't find those fundamental principles to be in conflict with reason. I find reason bolstering those fundamental assumptions, and those fundamental assumptions bolstering reason itself.
Right. Yeah, I noticed my name in there. I tend to read books like Trump reads. I just scan until I see my name pop out, and I go, okay, I'm going to read that paragraph.
Yeah, and I hope I wasn't unfair to you. I mean, I've read a lot of your stuff,
not
obviously.
At all. No, I get it. No, it's all good. Now, a couple points. First of all, how do you get all men are created equal from we were created in God's image? I don't see that as a derivative. So
the basic logical premise is that if I am made in God's image and you are made in God's image, we all have innate value. Now, you're correct, obviously, that there's a way to read it where human beings have innate value, but we're inherently unequal, and thus we can enslave one another. And the point that I make throughout the book is that I'm not a religious fundamentalist in the sense that I think you can only read the Bible and get everything you need just from reading the Bible. I think that there's an interplay between human reason and those fundamental assumptions. So there's no question that we've developed in our interpretation of the Bible from when the Bible was initially given. Obviously, the Bible has stuff in there about slavery, for example, and we have reasoned beyond slavery. And I'm not sure that, but the point is that the basic principle that human beings are created in the image of God, and therefore we all have innate value, that is a change from what came before philosophically, and creates the seed for growth. So again, fundamentalists believe that the Bible is everything and that you don't need human reason to interpret anything. And I think secular fundamentalists believe that reason is everything and you don't need fundamental assumptions to interpret everything. And I think that both of those are wrong. I think that reason without religion can end in some really dark places, and religion without reason can end in different kinds of but similarly dark places.
I think that's right. Let me read you a couple passages that I included in The Moral Arc when I was writing about Dinesh D'Souza's book, What's So Great About Christianity. He makes similar arguments as you do in that. Jefferson's Declaration, all men are created equal, he was asked in 1825 to explain where he got that phrase, and in a letter to Henry Lee in 1825 he wrote, "Neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular or previous writing, it was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for the occasion. All its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversation, in letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right, such as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc."
Yeah.
He's not citing any religious text there.
Well, although Jefferson spent a great deal of his life writing what he found to be a more rational version of the Bible, right? Going through the Bible and actually trying to say that there is a fundamental value to religion, even though he himself was a deist who wasn't a fundamentalist about religion. And Adams expressed similar sentiments, but again, rooted those sentiments in the idea that there is a common shared history. I think one of the chief contentions that I make in the book is that history didn't suddenly appear on the scene in 1760, that right. All of the ideas of the West actually have deeper roots than is commonly acknowledged. This is one of my quibbles that I have with, for example, Jonah Goldberg, who says the miracle occurs in basically the 18th century, and then he says, well, I don't know where that miracle comes from. And the idea is that history, as somebody who is an evolutionary biologist, you're constantly saying that when it comes to the history of science, that we have to look for deeper roots. I tend not to be a big believer that all good ideas just kind of randomly appeared in one place on Earth for no reason in 1750. I think that there are deeper roots to that. And the fact is that I do spend an awful lot of time in the book actually distinguishing between what I think was the European Enlightenment, the continental European Enlightenment, the French Revolution, for example, from the Scottish Enlightenment, the American Enlightenment, both of which have a lot more focus on retaining the value of religious institutions. The French Enlightenment was largely based on rejection of religious institutions. The famous statement that the French Revolution was about strangling the last king with the guts of the last priest is a very different feel from the American Revolution, which says in its founding documents that there are certain rights that are self-evident, but because of nature or nature's God.
Yeah, you talk about Edmund Burke in the book. I enjoyed that section very much. By the way, a lot of really interesting history in the book. I took him to make it distinguishing between the American Revolution and the French Revolution is that the French abandoned all previous social institutions and the rule of law and all the things that we had worked on for centuries, going back 1,000 years or so, and that was the problem. The Americans held on to the institutions that worked, abandoned the ones that they could abandon that didn't work, and that's the difference. So I don't see that as...
Well, I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with that, but I think one of the institutions that works is the fundamental value of religious institutions as community building, just from a secular point of view, as community building and vital to the idea of a common shared interest. I mean, when de Tocqueville talks about what makes America unique and our vast, broad panoply of associations, one of the biggest things that he talks about, and de Tocqueville is very heavy in his focus on the value of religion in American life, talking about the value of associations and church going. And again, he's doing that not even with relation to the truth or falsity of religion itself, but with regard to the social efficacy of keeping that there. And again, I think there's a strong case to be made as to regard, the truth or falsity of certain religious principles, or at least the idea that these are unprovable assumptions that need to be taken for granted by people who are secular. I mean, this is a main argument that I've had with Sam Harris repeatedly, is where Sam sort of thinks that he can reason himself back to the same principles that he and I share. And I think to myself, well, why do I share them with you then? Because, and the answer to me seems that shared history and shared tradition and a shared fundamental religious basis to Western society has a lot to do with that.
Yeah, for sure. Now, counterexample. So here I'll employ Jared Diamond's comparative method, where you can pile up examples of civilizations that were successful because they had Judeo-Christian roots. But what about successful societies either before Christianity and Judaism or after that were not successful? For example, pre-Christian civilizations, Samaria, Babylonia, Acadia, Assyria, Egypt, and Greece in the West, ancient civilizations in the Indus Valley in modern-day Pakistan and India, the Yellow River and Yangtze River Valley in modern-day China, and all of the, all these, they had great literature and artworks and monumental architecture and so on. They did that without the Judeo-Christian worldview.
100%. But I think that the main question that I'm asking is why in the last 2 centuries has life expectancy risen from 40 to 80? Why in the last 2 centuries is it that, I mean, there's no question that the modern world, all the stuff that we like, is dominated by Western thought. The West is the winner. I mean, just historically speaking, the West won. So the question is, why did the West win? And that's not to say that there haven't been achievements in other civilizations, but I mean, just relatively speaking, it is close to nothing in comparison with the progress that we've made in the last 2 centuries in virtually every aspect of human life. I think that there are people who will argue, like Harari, that basically progress doesn't matter. Maybe that people are happier in agrarian societies. Yeah, all I can say to that is try living in one and see how you like it.
Yeah, no, they're not. They're not. This idea that people without capitalism lived in these quaint little villages where everybody was happy is just nonsense.
Yeah,
they lived quiet lives of desperation.
Yeah, the difference is that all their kids were dying in infancy, right? I mean, like even if you want to say that they were happier, I mean, it's not quite as happy when you have 8 kids and 6 of them die of disease before age 5. Like that tends to have a certain amount of human unhappiness. That's why the argument that I really make is not to disparage the accomplishments of other civilizations. The question is, how did we get here? Like, if you think here is a good place, which I do, I think here is an amazing place. I think that you would not rather be born any time in history, any place in history, than the West on planet Earth right now. Like, there's no alternative, really. So what makes it so great? And that is a fundamental assumption, I'll admit. And if people want to argue with that fundamental assumption and say, well, I would rather be, in ancient Sumeria, then I guess you can do that. But it's not something I buy.
But again, let's talk about some of the exceptions. Like the Byzantine Empire was Eastern Orthodox Christian in the early AD 300s, and for 7 centuries produced nothing remotely like democracy and capitalism as we think of it. Early America wasn't particularly like it is today. 2 centuries ago, women couldn't vote. Slavery was legal, widely practiced. Capitalism's wealth was vouchsafed to a tiny minority of landowners. In the Middle Ages, there were Christian societies and nations, and yet none of this happened until, again, back to the miracle, something else. It's not just religion; it's something else.
Well, I totally agree, and I try to kind of trace the history of Western philosophy through these various machinations, because the question isn't just why did it happen in the West, it's also why didn't it happen in 1300, right? I mean, that's sort of the question that you're asking.
Right.
So why didn't it happen around I'm very fond of Thomistic thought, of Maimonidean thought. So why didn't it happen then? And I think one of the reasons that it didn't happen is because there wasn't enough room to use reason to question religion, closer to theocracy. This is why I'm very clear in the book about the idea that theocracy is a fundamental threat. Theocracy is a fundamental threat. I think that the idea that human reason unburdened by fundamental assumptions is the answer to theocracy, I think is completely flawed. But this is why, for example, the Protestant Reformation ends up being a very good thing for the West, despite the fact that originally the Protestant Reformation is a fundamentalist Reformation. Originally, the Protestant Reformation says to the Catholic Church, you guys are not ensconced enough in your own fundamental principle. I mean, Luther and Calvin are not big fans of either science or even human reason. They're much more fundamentalist. But the outgrowth of diversity of thought inside Christianity and the idea that religious minorities have to be protected because otherwise we're going to have endless war, the Treaty of Westphalia, right? All of this leads to a better balance between reason and religion. I mean, one of the points that I make, and the reason that I sort of trace the history, is because I think it's important to recognize that tension is important. And I think that when we try to remove the sources of tension by either removing reason on the one hand or religion on the other hand, you end up in a bad place. But that's not to say that the tension is constant or that it is constantly at the same pitch. And think of a rubber band that is sort of shrinking and growing and shrinking and growing. There may be an ideal point of tension, and that ideal point of tension builds a bridge that is strong enough to allow us to build a civilization on top of it. The point is that tension can be very easily lost by weakening either religion too much or reason too much. And I think that you see that today. I think that you're seeing people fleeing from reason in the fundamentalist Islamic world on behalf of religion. I think you're seeing people, believe it or not, freeing themselves from reason in large parts of the secular left, because the fundamental premises that religion takes for granted are actually, in many ways, being undermined by science, right? These are the fundamental premises of reason itself, objective truth itself, the idea of free will, which is fundamental to any idea of free markets or libertarian responsibility. Right? That's being undermined by a sort of deterministic view of the world. This is why I'm very critical of Sam's view on free will. So, the point is that if you imagine civilization as a suspension bridge, if you start to weaken one side of the suspension bridge, either side, then it can collapse. And if you strengthen one side too much, then the bridge is going to pull apart and the entire structure is going to fall. Civilization, in other words, is delicate. And the delicacy of civilization requires us to be in constant maintenance of both our reason and our religious convictions about the nature of the world and human life.
So this would explain my other counterexample of all the, say, Catholic and they're Christians, South American countries that have not prospered because they're very religious. They presumably have the same worldview you do, but they don't have the other components necessary for success.
That's right. And listen, as a Jew, I mean, there's been plenty of Christian persecution throughout history against Jews and against other people of other religions, obviously. And it's also necessary to point out here that when any religion uses reason as an admixture, it helps the civilization generally, right? I mean, look at Islamic civilization up to the 14th century. The idea that the notions of Greek reason were actually applied in Islamic civilization. You saw some great advances during that time. So you're always better off with reason and religion in balance. The tension that I see in society right now, if in the West, I see the tension as more anti-religious. In the Islamic world, obviously, the tension is the opposite. It's more plain secular reason.
Yeah, for what it's worth, a survey done in 2009 of 3,600 professional philosophers, 59% of them were compatibilists. They accept that we make choices. And now they're not libertarian free will, but they're not determinists like Sam is. The determinists were actually the smallest group. And it's something like, and this is Pinker's argument as well, that the choices we make, yes, we live in a determined universe, but we are part of the choosing process. So you're confronted with different options and you make choices. So I think we can square that circle and say we're compatibilists, we're making free choices, and we live in a determined universe.
Well, so this is a philosophy where I'll say that I actually agree with Sam that more in a dichotomous view of this question. I've always found compatibilism a little bit odd intellectually in the sense that the definition of freedom is not what most people think of. When most people say I am free to make a decision, what they mean is I had the capacity to choose otherwise, not I was not forced by an external human force into making that choice. When I say that I got up this morning and I had a choice to come to work, I generally don't mean that fate has ordered that I come into work, but there was nobody with a gun pointing it at my head. So this is, and I think that's the way most people live. If people actually believed, sort of what I think compatibilism is an easy way out of a difficult conundrum.
Well, the way Dennett puts it is degrees of freedom. So you and I have more degrees of freedom than a chimp and more than a dog and more than a cockroach and all the way down. And that, say, even within humans, you and I have more degrees of freedom than, say, the drug addict who simply cannot choose to not take the drug under certain circumstances once they've been addicted and so on. You and I, as not addicts, can turn that down and make that choice not to do that easier. And the law already kind of allows for those degrees of freedom in terms of, murder, for example. Did you know the difference between right and wrong? Did you plan it ahead of time, or was it a reactive, violent response? And those sorts of things. I think.
But I feel like that's a way of kind of cheaply eliding the question of responsibility, meaning that it is true that addicts have pressures that we don't have, and we take that into account. But the fundamental assumption there is that we therefore have the capacity to choose otherwise. Even that's making an assumption, which is that we have the capacity to choose otherwise. If the answer is we don't have the capacity to choose otherwise, like no matter what our circumstance, in the end, we are just an agglomeration of biological material wandering throughout the universe. Like we're Spinoza's stone, right? We've been thrown. We think that we are the force behind our own movement, but we're not. We're basically just meatballs wandering through space aimlessly. It makes it very difficult to say that we actually have more capacity to choose because we didn't choose not to be taking the drug, right? Fate has fated us not to be taking the drug in the same way that fate has fated the addict to take the drug. And I think it's very difficult to build a civilization on the basis of compatibilism. I think that libertarian free will, as unpopular as it's become in many circles, is still the fundamental basis for civilization. And I think that that's particularly true in planned action. So I devote a fair bit of the book near the end, talking about the question of free will, at least a few pages to the question of free will. And what exactly is free will, what is willed, what is not. Because obviously there's certain activity that we all acknowledge is not willed, right? You're not willing your heartbeat. And then there's certain activity that we all sort of acknowledge seems to be more willed. When we plan an action far in advance, is that something that are we an intervening force? In other words, and this is where I really believe that once we get away from the belief that we have the capacity to choose otherwise, it's difficult to make a case for why, for example, we shouldn't control society from above for the benefit of the majority and against the minority. Because it's all just biological material anyway. Why not benefit the majority at the expense of the few? I mean, more happiness for more people if it means getting rid of a few. So, these are fundamental assumptions religion makes. There's a sort of Oedipal tragedy to the secular humanist scientific movement in the sense that science cropped up saying human reason is supreme. It's supreme to religion. It wrecks religion because religion is based on fundamental assumptions about miracles and things happening that are outside the scope of reason. And so reason overcomes that. And then we reasoned our way into, okay, well, actually, we're all just determined balls of meat. Okay, well, now where do you go from there? Because all of the beautiful edifices that were built by reason,
I don't like this.
The assumption.
Yeah, I don't like this. I don't like this. We're just just protein and meat, electric meat in the brains. I mean, we're able to produce Bach and architecture and stuff. That's not just. I mean, that's an incredible. Even your sentences, I think the sentence that you're using, with which I fully agree, is making libertarian free will assumptions. When you say we are able to produce Bach, what you don't mean is that we, a chain of proteins and electrical signals in the brain generated by evolutionary biology. Because there's no we, right? I mean, this is the question when I debated Sam in San Francisco. Did Sam Harris write his book? Yes, I understand. I understand.
Yeah, I think Sam Harris wrote his book. I think you wrote your book. I think I wrote my book. I think that I had the capacity to not get up in the morning and not write my book.
See, some of this comes down to what you're calling it, what words we're using, and I hate to get bogged down in this particular debate because it's not important to your book, and we're on the same page. Even if it's an illusion, it's a good illusion. It works. I feel like I'm making free choices. I could have done otherwise. In something that one of the essays I wrote, I used the example of imagine a determinist who on a business trip has a fling and his wife finds out. Does he really say to his wife, honey, I could not have done otherwise? It's just a chain of commands all the way back. It's all just neurons firing. He couldn't finish the sentence before the hand would come across his face. Of course he could have done otherwise, and you better choose the other way. I agree with that. Let's switch back to the book. So, are we throwing it all away? Okay, sometimes some parts of this I agree with you. Conspiracies have replaced reason, and subjective perceptions have replaced subjective observation. Yes, facts have been buried to make way for feelings. A society of essential oils and self-esteem has replaced the society of logic. I love that sentence. We're more divided than any time in the recent past. Is that true? What's our metric? My first vote was 72 with Nixon, the Nixon campaign. Things were pretty divided back then with Watergate and...
when I say the recent past, I do mean the very recent past. Meaning I'm not saying we're more divided than we were in the 1960s. That's absurd. I'm not saying that we're more divided than we were during the Civil War. That's, of course, absurd.
Right.
The question is really kind of why are we divided at all? I mean, things are better than at any time in human history.
Right.
And it's not close. Right. We've had decades of unremitting economic progress, essentially.
Yeah.
We've had decades of unremitting growth in life expectancy and scientific achievement. And we're tearing each other's hair out about nonsense half the time.
Right.
I mean, it's really kind of stunning.
Yeah, you say in here, let me get the exact quote because it's quite good. We're killing ourselves at the highest rates in decades. So you're talking about suicide rates here. Okay, so here is Pinker's graph. So you're correct. There's a little uptick there. Can you see that?
Right. Yep.
So there's a little uptick with the United States, so it's true. But the long-term trend going back, it's still declining somewhat, and it's steadily declining without an uptick in other Western societies. So first of all, if America's so great, how come we have higher rates of suicide? But the question is, maybe this is an aberration just temporarily, and maybe that's your point.
Maybe it is. I mean, and that sort of is the point. We'll see if it turns into a long-term trend. I would suggest that, the fact that America's suicide rate is upticking now is because America's going through, basically, I think that everything that Europe goes through, we go through about 30 years later. And I think that as I talk about European philosophy in the book, the sort of existentialist philosophy that followed World War II, which was rife with a certain amount of nihilism and despair, essentially rejected by Americans for several decades afterward. And I think it's started to sink in a little bit more right now in this moment. And that's, I think a problem. But listen, could it reverse itself tomorrow? Yeah. And then I would say, okay, well, maybe I'll re-examine the fundamental premises. Maybe I don't have to worry quite as much. Maybe civilization is more durable than I think it is. But if I'm looking right now at sort of conflict in Western society, there's very little question that the amount of maybe it's because I'm in politics, but the amount of polarization and anger seems to have risen at a supremely dramatic rate in the last few years.
Yeah, the data on that from polling data since the 90s, the number of people that self-identify as extremely Republican or extremely Democratic or liberal and conservative has further divided. It's almost like two bell curve now.
Yeah,
rather
and
than
not
one.
only that. I mean, one of the most interesting charts I think I talk about it in the book is the chart that talks about how many members of each party see the other party as the enemy and is morally deficient.
Yes.
And what you see is that actually that's been rising steadily since the beginning of the 1990s. Democrats outweighed Republicans in that by a fairly large margin up until 2016, at which point Republicans took a massive jump and started saying, I see Democrats as the enemy too. That's right. That's not good stuff. The real question in the United States right now is what are the ties that continue to bind us? And they used to be fundamental, very root level ties. And those are some of the fundamental assumptions that I think have been lost and that I'm worried about. The fundamental assumption that, again, we are all equivalent in our own, in our value, whether it's before God or for some secular reason, that we all have freedom of speech, that we are all required to respect each other's views enough not to get involved in each other's lives. Like these were certain things that were sort of part of the American dream at the very least, and we didn't always live up to it. But that was what bound us together. And I feel like a lot of that stuff is falling apart. People seem a lot more willing to utilize whatever methods are at their disposal in order to compel their ideological enemies to do what it is they see fit.
Yeah. So, and the driving force behind, sort of the underlying current of your book is moral purpose. So you write about a framework for meaning, four different components: individual purpose, individual capacity, communal purpose, and communal capacity. So unpack those for us in light of, there's research by psychologists on happiness and meaning. For example, they tease those apart and say they're two different things. I can do something that makes me happy today that isn't going to make me give me a meaningful life tomorrow. And there's things I could do today that are not fun. My example is a caretaker. I was a caretaker for two of my four parents, and this was not fun at all.
Right.
And I was not happy driving my dad to these hospitals. Oh, it's just so frustrating. But now, as a older person, I feel better about myself. So tease apart those differences between happiness and meaning.
Sure. So I think that we constantly think that happiness is the stuff that makes us happy today. I think the Aristotelian view of happiness, and this is, I think, the view the founders took also, is a series of responsible decisions made in accordance with virtue and reason over the course of a life. And then you look back and you say, well, that was a happy, purposeful life. The example that I actually use in the book is the recent death of Charles Krauthammer. He wrote a letter at the very end of his life, where a beautiful letter, where he specifically talks about, I feel like I lived a life of purpose because I was involved in meaningful discussions. It wasn't always easy, but this is part of the burden of being part of Western civilization. Like picking up responsibility is one of the things that makes us happy on a deeper level, more than just going out and golfing today. Like there's lots of stuff that brings us joy. The question is, when you see the people in your life who you think are happy, they generally are the most purpose-driven people. They're the people who feel like they have a reason for waking up in the morning and going and doing something. And so I tease apart different elements of what it is to live with purpose. Those four elements, I think, are individual capacity, individual purpose, communal capacity, communal purpose. So first of all, there's a distinction in how we live between being an individual and being a member of a community. We all feel that we are both. Right? Because that's true. Just human beings are social creatures. If you feel like you are alone in the universe, it's very difficult. People become depressed. Communal ties matter. At the same time, you want to feel like you as an individual matter. You're not just a cog in a machine, right? You have a larger meaning. So what I try to figure out is which civilization can be pointed to that maximizes these four elements. So individual purpose, what I mean by that is you're alone on a desert island. What gets you up in the morning? What makes you feel like your life is worthwhile? Removed from the responsibilities for other people, what is it that makes your life worthwhile? And by polling data anyway, it tends to show that religious people feel a heavy sense of individual purpose and meaning because they feel like they have a relationship with something beyond, namely God. They're not alone even when they're alone, in other words. So individual purpose, meaning that you have a reason to get up and take responsibility for yourself, that's a deeply important thing. If you don't feel like you have it, you tend to swing too far to communal purpose, which very often ends in sort of tyranny, because if you're part of a collective, it's easy to look at the individual as non-meaningful. That's sort of the French Revolution view, that individual rights are subsumed under communal rights. Individual capacity, what I talk about there is the discussion we were having earlier, the idea that you as an individual have the capacity to choose. You have free will. You are responsible for your own actions. You have the capacity to reason, to understand, to have discussions with other people. Anything that undermines those fundamental assumptions that make you feel like you don't have responsibility for yourself, you're going to be depressed. Because even if you have a purpose, which is to get up in the morning and do X, if you feel like you don't have the capacity to do that, that's depressing and upsetting. You're not gonna be happy. Communal purpose is the idea that we, as a broader people, or as humanity, if you want to go the broadest view, that there is something that we have to do together. Maybe that's pushing toward economic progress. Maybe that's pushing toward better valuing each other as human beings. We have to feel like if there's a massive obstacle that we can come together and solve that, because communities do have more power, obviously, than individuals. My preference is that those communities are voluntarily formed and not compelled by government, obviously, and that's where communal capacity comes in. Meaning we have to have a system that allows for individual purpose and individual capacity while still allowing us to get together and then do stuff that communities have to do together. And it's with communal capacity that things start to go awry very often with, for example, socialist countries. The notion that the community now outweighs the individual purpose, individual capacity go by the wayside. The only important stuff is the stuff that we do together. And the only reason you as an individual are important is because you are a cog in the machine. And that's where, top-down fascism, socialism in the Venezuelan sense, that's where that stuff becomes incredibly dangerous.
Yeah. So in Heavens on Earth, my outline of those things that matter, love and family, based on research here, that, you ask people what makes you happy and living a fulfilling life. Love and family, meaningful work and career, social and political involvement, transcendency and spirituality, which for me to even say those words, I realize sounds crazy, and challenges and goals. Now let's take Krauthammer as an example. I never knew him. I'm a great admirer. I've read all of his books, and I certainly know what his politics are, but I can't say that I know what his religious beliefs are. He seemed to have kept that out of it. In other words, he seemed to have fulfilled all your criteria for leading a deep, purposeful life without, I don't know, maybe he did believe in God. I have no idea. But it didn't seem religion was a big part of that. So can you have this without that?
So I think that you can. I mean, I'm not arguing that you have to be a religious person in order to be happy. What I am arguing is that for the vast bulk of people, it's going to be very difficult to reach that without a religious belief in something higher in which you're involved as an individual, particularly when it comes to individual purpose. This is true. And again, going to the central theme of the book, or one of the central themes of the book, without the fundamental assumptions underlying a lot of this, I think, are assumptions that have historically been religious in nature. So when I talk about individual capacity, that is reliant on certain assumptions that I think we have to make about ourselves. You can try to do it from a secular perspective, unbased by reason, and just to say, okay, that's an assumption I'm making. Fine, that's cool. But for most people, saying that it's an absolute truth derived from an argument about God, that's more motivating and more compelling. Yeah. By the way, as far as Krauthammer, I did an interview with his son on the Sunday Special maybe 3-4 weeks ago. His views on religion were basically that he believed that religion was extremely important, even though he himself was agnostic, and he was militantly anti-atheist in the sense that he did not believe that, at least is my understanding, is that he didn't believe that a full proof of atheism was available, essentially.
Right. Well, yeah, it's good to remember atheism is not a worldview. It's just a particular statement about a right. thing. Does God exist? Really, it's what Pinker and I are pushing for is this humanism or Enlightenment humanism, which sounds a little better, or secular humanism. I don't know what. Just something that gives us, again, that same sense, like we are working toward this grander goal. It's not just about me.
No, and in the book, I talk about both you and Pinker in this context. And what I say is I really admire what you guys are trying to do. I think that to do that, you don't do it as much as Pinker does, I think. Pinker is militantly anti-religion in a lot of his work. And I think that that's a mistake in the sense that I admire what people are trying to do in rebuilding a lot of the fundamental bases of Western civilization. But those fundamental bases were historically rooted in religion. And I think they were rooted in religion for a pretty good reason, which is that people want to believe that not only want to believe, but I think that they have some good reasons to believe that these truths are not self-evident, that they are objectively true, and that they're assumptions that have to be made. So in other words, I think that the attempt to separate religion off by labeling religion bad and supplementable and supplanted by human reason alone, again, that tension has to exist. I think removing one of the sources of tension is a problem.
I'm conflicted about this. Of course, I'm friends with Harris and Dawkins and Dennett, and Hitch was a friend, and so on. So when we talk about just claims about the universe, the Earth is 10,000 years old, or things like that, I'm on board with just debunking obviously false claims, and so are you. It does come down to some of these ultimate questions that we can't answer. Where did the universe come from? We don't have the answers. You yourself, in the last page of the book, your ending is just so beautiful about your I think it was your son or your daughter. Asking if you will you always be my daddy? This is a very sweet ending. Surprised, I answered, "Of course, sweetheart." But she clarified, "One day I'll be older, and really old people die, so will you still be there?" I felt a catch in my throat because, naturally, she's right. I don't like to think about death with regard to my own parents, let alone with respect to my children. And while I'm a believer in the afterlife, there's no real way to know. I don't know what comes after this. Nobody does. Hallelujah. I'm gonna make you an honorary member of the Skeptics just for that sentence. I think that's right. And so I guess I don't always fault people for believing, or at least committing to an institution like their particular religion that makes them feel good. If it works, if it helps you get through the night, as Jordan is always talking about, life is hard. It is kind of Hobbesian, nasty, brutish, and short, even though it's not as nasty, brutish, and short as it used to be. In the end, we're all going to be gone. So I don't fault people for doing that, or even saying, this is my belief, it's what I believe, I can't prove it absolutely. And so I like that you ended the book that way. I think it kind of opens up the window there for more dialogue between believers and non-believers, or religious people and secular people. The rise of the nuns, that people not committed to religion is increasing. So this could be a tension in the future.
I mean, I hope that it is. Again, I think that the point there is I'm fully willing to admit I can't prove a lot of the things that I assume, but those things are necessary to assume, at least with regard to individual capacity. And if we don't make those assumptions, then we have to acknowledge the power of human reason and the limits to human reason. If we refuse to acknowledge the limits of human reason, we get ourselves in all sorts of trouble. And if we don't acknowledge the power of human reason, then we get ourselves in all sorts of different trouble.
Right, and so even collective groups, or whatever we want to call, like the IDW, or groups that we hang out with, political affiliations, and so on, all that is part of that social capital that binds us. And what do you think? What do you make of people that make the argument like government mail systems and educational systems are like social capital and collective things that we work toward? How is that different other than where the money comes from to pay for it?
I mean, the only thing that I would say is that anybody who attempts to build social capital through force is going to fail. And so if the idea is that you're building social capital by creating an educational system where you compel people to pay into this educational system run by people who they don't actually want their kids to be educated by, that's a problem. So I'm not against public education, particularly on a local level where people are generally consenting to be part of the public education system. And we all sort of acknowledge, particularly on a local level, that we want our kids to be educated. Kids can't take care of themselves. Somebody has to pay for them. All that's fine. But if the idea is that government is, as they said in the 2012 DNC, government is the only thing we have in common, well, if that's the case, then we don't have anything in common.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Okay, I want to be sensitive to your time. I know you got to go off and produce 6 more hours of content today. So if you were president of the United States before you deposed yourself, what are some of the steps you would take to kind of push us in the right direction away from these little blips we seem to be going through at the moment?
I mean, the first thing that I would do is massively reduce the power of the executive branch. I mean, I'd fire pretty much everyone in the executive branch because I think, again, that we've come upon this weird idea that government is supposed to fill all the gaps in social capital. And I don't think the government is capable of doing that. I think that minimizing the size of government and to a certain extent requiring people to build social capital in communities to rebuild all of that is going to be a positive exercise. Now, it doesn't come without growing pains, obviously. That means that for certain communities, it's going to be difficult to reform those social bonds. But reliance on government to create social bonds that are ersatz, I don't think is a real solution. So reducing the size and scope of government is the first thing. And honestly, I want a country where I don't care who's president, is the truth. I want a country where I don't really care who's elected to Congress because they just don't have that much power over my life. That's my ideal. So anything that can allow me to re-embrace my local community, the people I want to be with, the rules that I want to impose with those people in small groups, because it's easier to find consent in a group of 10 than it is to find consent in a group of 1 million. All of that would be good.
Sounds good, Ben. Well, again, I don't want to go on too long. I know you have a lot of work to do. The book is The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. I really enjoyed reading it. It's a great read.
Oh, thank you.
And what's next? How are you going to top this one? This is kind of a big picture.
I'm interested. I've been thinking about it a lot. I think that the next book that I'd be interested in writing is something like the 8 biggest decisions you'll ever make, just about about how people we're living in a world where it's very easy to shirk responsibility and suggest that broad social forces are responsible for both successes and failures. And that's simply not true in a free country. There are certain decisions that we can make and that all social science essentially suggests are vital for us to make. And if we can re-embrace that decision-making, then we'll be making our lives better. Politics very rarely makes your life better unless you're actively removing a serious barrier to progress. Most of the problems in our own lives are problems that we've created for ourselves.
Do you mean things like graduate from high school, get a job, and get married before you have children?
That's it.
Yeah. You should call it the 12 steps for life. The 12 rules for life. Yes, that's better. That's a 12 rules.
Hey, man, if I can get a share of Jordan's profits, I mean, I'm Bernie Sanders when it comes to that stuff. So,
well, there does seem to be a real hunger for that. And it's not just that people aren't religious and they're turning to Jordan for ersatz religion. There's something else going on there. I think that's just common to all of us. Just a need for a reason to get up in the morning and do something productive, like start with making your room, making your bed, cleaning your room, and so forth. I think there's something to that. The self-help gurus have, all the way back to Napoleon Hill and Think and Grow Rich and, thinking positive and all that. It seems to work to the extent that you apply it.
That's right. The more individual responsibility you take for your life and the less you worry about societal forces, generally the better off you are. That doesn't mean we can't, as a community, try and improve the rules that govern society or get rid of absolute barriers again. But the vast majority in a free country like the United States, which, again, I'm making an assumption, America is the freest country in the history of the world. If you disagree with that, feel free. But I think that that's fairly self-evident. If you believe that, then that means that most of the responsibility lies in us to improve our own lives.
And just parenthetically, for things like abortion rates, suicide rates, and these kinds of things, childhood mortality rates, we're higher than European countries. So you wouldn't attribute that to religion, I presume. It's something with failure of government or markets.
When it comes to, we'd have to break down each one of those in turn. But the fact is that in the United States, for example, abortion rates are higher not because of lack of availability of birth control. It's because there are a lot of people who are having sex out of wedlock, and I would attribute that somewhat to the sexual revolution, to welfare incentivization. There's a lot of kind of moral hazard in the way American policy is done. Also to, frankly, a certain lack of religion that has come up. America was a much more religious country in the 1920s and 30s. America was very poor in the 1930s. People weren't popping out babies out of wedlock as a solution to that. So.
Heather McDonald makes this point. Now, she's an atheist, but she says we need to get back to some fundamental values, like the default position for women should be, no, I'm not having sex with you. Now, the guy can try to talk her into it, but he's going to walk away with a no if that's the way it is. Her argument is that we've flipped that. The default position is, yes, we're going to have sex all the time. And then if the woman changes her mind, she has to talk the guy into no, which is much harder.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Again, I think that the disconnection between sex and baby making is great in some ways, and it's had some moral hazard in some other ways, meaning that it's great. I'm very much in favor of birth control and people being able to decide when they want to have kids. That's fine. But it used to be that there was actual responsibility that came along with sex, and then we suggested there is no responsibility that comes along with sex, and then we reverse engineered our way into single motherhood by saying no responsibility that comes along with sex. Oops, produced a baby, but the responsibility doesn't attach to sex. Well, that's going to have some pretty negative ramifications.
Right. Well, you've got your work cut out for you on those.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, we continue the dialogue at an IDW event or on your podcast or whatever.
That'd be great.
And but again, congratulations on the book. Good job, and thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks. I really appreciate it, Michael.
Bye-bye.
Be well.